Welcome! You're listening to the Uncharted Lancaster podcast, where we explore the hidden histories, forgotten places, and long-buried secrets of Lancaster County. Using modern digital storytelling tools, each episode brings a new piece of local lore to life, revealing the strange, the surprising, and the stories history left behind. Let's begin.
So picture this. It is the dead of winter in the early 19th century. You are standing at this lethal, violently churning bottleneck on the Susquehanna River.
Oh, and it is freezing. Just brutally cold.
Right, exactly. And you're looking at this massive, jagged river gorge, a gorge that, by the way, the architect of the United States Capitol had explicitly declared physically impossible to bridge.
Literally impossible. He put it in writing.
He did. But today we are looking at the foul-mouthed engineering genius who essentially stared down that impossible abyss, the guy who braved 60-foot deep rivers of moving ice and basically said, watch me.
It is such an unbelievable story.
It really is. We are resurrecting Theodore Burr's 1815 McCall's Ferry Bridge. And for this deep dive, we have compiled this massive stack of historical texts.
Yeah, we've got old engineering journals, like the Cornell Civil Engineer.
Right, and historical surveys such as some early county bridges, plus all this wild local folklore from the Lancaster York History and Legend.
Because you can't tell this story without the folklore.
No, you really can't. So our mission today is to dig through all these old newspaper clippings, these engineering diagrams and river legends to unearth a massive wooden skeleton that vanished, over 200 years ago.
It's basically an epic battle of man versus nature.
Totally. A masterclass in crisis engineering. And really, it's just a look at what human ambition looks like when it flat out refuses to take no for an answer.
Yeah, I mean, the story of McCall's Ferry requires us to completely reorient our understanding of early infrastructure.
How so?
Well, we're just so accustomed to the modern marvels of, steel and concrete.
Yeah.
Computer-aided hydrodynamics. It is so easy to forget what a terrifying adversary a river used to be.
Oh, for sure.
This narrative forces us back into an era where just crossing a major waterway was a genuine roll of the dice with your life. And the Susquehanna, particularly at this specific location, was the ultimate antagonist.
I honestly think of this deep dive almost like a forensic archaeological expedition. But, before we get to the skeleton of the bridge or the man who built it, we really need to understand the crime scene.
The environment itself.
Exactly. The environment is the primary villain of this story. We are looking at a location on the lower Susquehanna River, and it acts as this crucial connection point between Mardock Township in Lancaster County and Lower Chanceford Township in York County.
Right, and the sources describe this location not just as a river crossing, but as a severe geographical trap.
A trap, yeah. Because the river narrows down to 16 perches. And I had to look this up because what is the modern equivalent of a perch in this context? And why does that width matter so much?
So a perch is this old surveyor's measurement. It's equivalent to 16.5 feet.
Okay, so we just multiply that.
Right, so we are talking about a width of roughly 264 feet.
Which doesn't sound that crazy at first.
It doesn't. But to understand why that is so dangerous, you have to look at the broader hydrodynamics of the Susquehanna River Basin.
Right.
The Susquehanna drains a massive portion of the eastern United States, parts of New York, a huge swath of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and for most of its length, it is famously wide and relatively shallow.
Yeah, it's like a mile wide in some places.
Exactly. But when it hits the high range of granite hills near McCall's Ferry, the geology just refuses to yield.
It hits a literal wall.
Yes. The river is suddenly squeezed from this wide, sprawling flow into a tight, deep rock corridor. It acts as a literal funnel.
So it takes all that volume, millions of gallons of water, and forces it through a tight, unforgiving rock chute.
Yep.
And the historical sources describe the water passing through here as rapid but smooth. The real danger, though, is the volatility, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Because it's a funnel. When heavy rains occur upstream, the water level at McCall's Ferry doesn't just rise gradually like a tide. It spikes violently and suddenly.
Well, yeah, the physics of a bottleneck dictate that.
Oh.
If the volume of fluid increases, but the width of the channel remains static, the velocity must increase, and the depth must rise drastically.
There's nowhere else for the water to go.
Exactly. There is simply nowhere else for the kinetic energy to go but up and faster. And this volatility is exactly what drew the attention of Benjamin Henry Latrobe in 1801.
The architect of the Capitol.
The very same. Latrobe was commissioned by the state of Pennsylvania to survey the lower Susquehanna to assess its potential for navigation and canals.
Okay.
So he arrives at McCall's Ferry to do standard engineering reconnaissance, which basically meant he needed to map the bedrock profile of the channel.
Which brings us to one of the most famous and kind of dubious claims in early American engineering.
Oh, the sounding line.
Yes. Latrobe drops a sounding line to find the bottom of the channel, and he lets out 180 feet of line with a heavy lead weight attached to it, and he fails to find the bottom.
He just runs out of rope.
Right. And he reports back to the United States Congress in 1807, stating explicitly that because of the unbottomable depth and the sudden flooding, it will never be possible to erect a safe bridge at this place.
The bold claim.
It is. And I have to challenge Latrobe's conclusion here. I mean, he drops a line 180 feet and says it's bottomless. But rivers aren't black holes.
No, they're not.
Wasn't he just using inadequate tools for the current? I mean, why did everyone accept this quote-unquote bottomless myth as scientific fact?
It is a really crucial distinction to make. Latrobe was a highly educated, rational engineer. He wasn't suggesting there was a literal portal to the center of the Earth down there.
Right, of course.
The problem was sheer hydrodynamics. When you drop a sounding lead into a current flowing at the extreme velocity seen in that granite funnel, the water exerts immense drag force on the line itself.
Oh, I see. So the line doesn't drop straight down.
Exactly. It gets swept out at a really sharp angle.
Yeah.
So paying out 180 feet of rope does not mean you have reached a vertical depth of 180 feet.
You could just be measuring sideways water.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
You might only be 60 or 80 feet down, the rest of the line trailing horizontally in the current. Latrobe knew this, but his conclusion remained valid for the technology of the time.
Because if you can't hit the bottom, you can't build on it.
Exactly. If the current is so violent that an immensely heavy-sounding lead cannot find purchase, then driving wooden pilings or building a traditional masonry pier in that channel is an engineering impossibility.
Okay, so from a practical 1801 perspective, it really was functionally bottomless. You cannot build a foundation on something you cannot reach.
Precisely.
And he flat out tells Congress it's impossible. Yet the sources show that local business interests and the state legislature just remained obsessed with crossing exactly at McCall's Ferry.
They wouldn't let it go.
No, they kept referring to it as the most practicable place for a bridge, which is insane. If the preeminent architect in the nation calls it a death trap, why force the issue?
Well, the economic geography of the Mid-Atlantic demanded it. In the early 19th century, infrastructure was the primary bottleneck for the economic expansion of the young nation.
Because moving stuff was so hard.
Excruciatingly slow, expensive, and seasonal. Moving overland was a nightmare. And this specific spot was the nexus of major continental arteries.
Oh.
On the Lancaster side, you had Street Road, which is a heavily trafficked turnpike leading directly to Philadelphia.
So a major highway of the time.
Right. So if you were attempting to move freight, agricultural goods, livestock, or, the United States mail between Philadelphia and the new capital in Washington, D.C.
McCall's Ferry was the shortcut.
It was the most direct line of communication, especially in the winter months when other overland routes just became completely impassable quagmires.
So the desperation for trade routing simply overrode the scientific pessimism.
Money talks.
It really does. The geography forces the issue, creating the scenario where human beings decide to build a massive structure exactly where nature is screaming at them not to.
Yeah, the state of Pennsylvania essentially needed a visionary who was completely unbothered by Latrobe's warnings.
They needed a guy who specialized in the impossible.
And they found Theodore Burr.
Theodore Burr. Let's talk about him.
Well, Burr brings an entirely different pedigree to the table than Latrobe. Where Latrobe was formally educated and dealt in grand masonry and neoclassical architecture, Burr was a master of timber.
He worked with wood.
Right. He emerged from a tradition of millwrights and frontier builders. Interestingly, he was a cousin of Aaron Burr.
Wait, the vice president?
Yeah, the one involved in the famous duel with Alexander Hamilton.
Wow, okay. That's quite the family tree.
Yeah. But Theodore's legacy was built entirely on his intuitive grasp of structural forces in wood. And interestingly enough, the historical record regarding Burr himself is notoriously fragmented.
Yeah, I noticed that. We see discrepancies in our sources immediately. Like one claims he was born in 1762 in Torringford, Connecticut.
And another insists it was 1771 in Torrington.
So almost a decade difference. But, while the exact year of his birth might be muddy, his resume by the time he arrived at the Susquehanna was completely ironclad.
Oh, he wasn't a novice looking to make a name for himself on a crazy gamble.
Definitely not. In 1792, he was building grist mills and dams in Oxford, New York. He built the first stringer bridge across the Chenango River. He successfully bridged the Hudson River at Waterford.
But the project that truly highlights his genius and sets the stage for McCall's Ferry was his 1808 bridge in Schenectady, New York.
Right, because that was a 997-foot suspension bridge.
Yes.
But, and this is the crazy part, he didn't use steel cables or iron chains. He built a suspension bridge out of wood.
Which is an extraordinary conceptual leap.
How does that even work?
Well, traditional timber bridges relied primarily on compression, so heavy logs resting on pillars, pushing weight straight down.
Okay, that makes sense.
But suspension bridges rely on tension, materials being pulled tight, and wood is incredibly strong under compression, but managing its tensile strength, especially over a 997-foot span using only joinery and timber pegs.
No nails or bolts.
Mostly just perfectly cut wood fitting into other wood. It requires a profound understanding of how forces distribute through a structure. Burr was literally experimenting with the absolute physical limits of his materials.
That mastery of tension and compression made him the perfect candidate for Pennsylvania's impossible gorge.
Absolutely.
So by 1809, the state legislature is aggressively authorizing bridge companies to tackle the Susquehanna. And in 1811, they officially incorporate the McCall's Ferry Bridge Company.
And the financial structuring here provides a great window into how massive these undertakings were.
Yeah, the money side of this is wild. The company authorized the issuance of 1,000 shares of stock at $100 each.
Which was a massive amount of money back then.
Right, and subscribers paid $5 up front just to secure their shares. Plus, the state of Pennsylvania appropriated $20,000 directly to the project.
That capitalization structure, essentially raising over $100,000 in early 19th century currency, it just demonstrates immense public and private faith in Burr.
It was a staggering sum, and Burr's blueprint for the crossing was equally staggering. He proposed a bridge roughly 570 feet long in total.
And 30 to 32 feet wide.
So capable of handling 2 lanes of heavy wagon traffic.
Yes, passing each other.
To achieve this, he planned to use what would eventually be patented in 1817 as the Burr Arch Truss.
And we really need to unpack the physics of the Burr Arch Truss.
Yes, please, because this isn't just an architectural detail, right? It is literally the only reason this bridge didn't immediately snap in half.
Exactly.
Our sources describe it as sandwiching a multiple king post truss between 2 massive long wooden arches. How does this actually work in practice? Like, why does putting a truss inside an arch allow you to span distances that a flat beam could never achieve?
Okay, so we have to look at how wood behaves under stress. If you lay a simple flat wooden beam across a gap, gravity pulls down on the center.
Right, it sags.
Yes. The bottom fibers of the wood stretch, that's tension. The top fibers crush together, that's compression.
Okay, I follow.
Over a short distance, a thick timber can handle that. But over long distance, the beam will sag and eventually snap under its own dead weight, let alone the live weight of a wagon rolling across it.
So a flat beam is out.
Right. Now, a multiple king post truss tries to solve this by introducing triangles.
Triangles, the strongest shape.
Exactly. It uses vertical posts and diagonal braces to take the downward force of gravity and redirect it along the length of the timbers. It turns bending forces into pushing and pulling forces.
Okay, so the triangles are structurally rigid. They don't deform easily. So the truss stiffens the roadway.
Right. But a truss alone still has span limits. Eventually, the sheer weight of the timber framing itself becomes too heavy to support over a huge gap.
Ah, okay, so that is where the arch comes in.
Precisely. An arch is a pure compression structure. It takes all the downward weight and channels it outward, following the curve of the arch, driving the force directly into the stone abutments on the shores.
Sounds perfect. What's the catch?
The catch is that a massive wooden arch has a fatal flaw. If you put a heavy moving load like a team of draft horses pulling a loaded freight wagon on just one side of the arch, it creates uneven pressure.
Oh, because the weight isn't in the middle.
Exactly. The loaded side compresses, which can actually force the unloaded side to buckle upward. The arch loses its perfect geometry and just collapses.
That sounds disastrous. So Burr's genius was marrying the two systems to cancel out their respective weaknesses.
Yes.
The massive wooden arches carry the dead load, the sheer crushing weight of the bridge itself transferring it to the stone shores. But the multiple king post truss, which is tightly sandwiched and bolted to those arches, acts as a rigid spine.
It handles the live load.
Right, so when the heavy wagon rolls across, the rigid truss distributes that uneven weight across the entire length of the arch, preventing any single point from buckling.
It is a brilliant symbiosis of tension and compression. But, having the perfect design on paper is totally useless if the geography won't let you build it.
Because of Latrobe's bottomless channel?
Exactly. At McCall's Ferry, Burr slammed directly into that physical reality. The riverbed profile was brutally uneven.
Right. The sources say on the York County side, the water was relatively shallow with a reachable bedrock bottom.
But on the Lancaster County side lay the 180-foot deep, violently fast channel.
So Burr couldn't build a series of evenly spaced piers across the river like you would for a normal bridge.
No, he couldn't.
He had to build one single massive stone pier, 55 feet wide at its base, and he had to plant it entirely on the York County side, right at the edge of the deep channel.
Which forced a wildly asymmetrical design.
Yeah. The span from the York shore to the pier was manageable. But the span from that stone pier, stretching all the way across the bottomless abyss to the Lancaster shore, it had to be an unprecedented length.
Unprecedented is the word. The sources vary slightly here. They record the main arch at either exactly 360 feet or 360 feet and 4 inches.
I mean, regardless of the 4 inches, it was the longest single wooden-covered span known in the world at that time.
By far.
Spanning 360 feet without any intermediate support is a terrifying engineering prospect even today.
With modern steel, it's a project. With 19th century timber, it's almost mythical.
The logistics of this are staggering. I really want to look at the actual construction process because having a blueprint for a 360-foot arch is meaningless if you can't get the timber into the air over a lethal rapid.
Right.
I mean, you can't build traditional scaffolding. You can't drive temporary support columns down into a channel where a sounding lead gets swept away. You are essentially trying to build a horizontal skyscraper over a meat grinder.
That's a great way to put it.
How did Burr even plan to erect this arch without it falling into the river during construction?
Well, he had to build the arch on the surface of the water itself, maneuver it into position, and then hoist it up.
On the water.
Yes. Burr actually detailed this harrowing process in a letter he wrote to a fellow bridge builder, a guy named Reuben Field. In the letter, Burr estimated the river depth at 150 feet and noted the channel width fluctuated wildly between 348 and 690 feet, depending on the water level.
So it's constantly changing.
Right. So his initial plan was an exercise in massive scale buoyancy. He constructed 8 massive floats, essentially giant custom-built rafts.
Okay, so he lines these 8 massive rafts up along the Lancaster shore, carefully fitting them into the jagged, uneven projections of the rock face to keep them stable.
Right.
And on top of these rafts, his crew erects 16 bents.
Yeah, and a bent is basically a tall, heavy wooden timber frame.
Right. And the height of each bent varied, deliberately designed to curve upward, acting as a cradle. So he was building a custom floating dry dock.
Exactly.
The plan was to assemble the massive wooden arch piece by piece on top of these cradles, perfectly shaping it, and then figure out a way to move the entire assembly across the gap.
Which was an incredibly delicate operation. And it relied entirely on the river remaining relatively calm.
Which, spoiler alert, it didn't.
No, it did not. Burr was operating in late autumn, moving into the brutal winter of 1814 and 1815. And the Susquehanna is notoriously unforgiving in winter.
Yeah, in December, the temperature plummeted and the project encountered a phenomenon known as anchor ice.
Ah, anchor ice.
I had to dive deep into the hydrodynamics of anchor ice because it sounds almost supernatural. It isn't just a frozen crust floating on the surface of the water, right?
Not at all. Anchor ice forms at the bottom of the river.
Which is wild. How does that happen?
Well, when the air temperature is bitterly cold, the turbulent rapids supercool the water. So it drops below freezing without turning to solid ice right away.
Okay, supercooled water.
Right. And when this supercooled water is forced down by the churning current and touches the rocky riverbed, the rocks act as nucleation sites.
So ice rapidly crystallizes and forms directly on the bottom.
Exactly. It grows into these massive, sludgy underwater structures. And eventually the buoyancy of this ice overcomes its grip on the rocks, and enormous chunks break loose, tumbling along the riverbed, carrying stones and debris with them.
That sounds incredibly destructive. At McCall's Ferry, thousands of tons of this anchor ice funneled into the narrow granite gorge. It began acting like an underwater dam, choking off the flow of the river from the bottom up.
And because the gorge is a bottleneck, when the flow is choked by anchor ice, the water level reacts violently.
Yeah, Burr's letter to Reuben Field describes a state of absolute chaos. During winter storms, the water in the gorge was rising and falling 10 to 12 feet in rapid succession. The river was literally heaving.
Just imagine the kinetic energy involved there. You have a delicate, half-finished, 360-foot wooden arch weighing many tons, balanced precisely on wooden bents, which are balanced on rafts, which are now being violently pitched up and down by an entire story.
It's a nightmare. The anchor ice and surface ice began crowding the floats, grinding against them, attempting to crush the entire dry dock against the rocky Lancaster shore.
Yeah.
The wooden scaffolding began buckling and breaking apart under the torsional stress. The immense weight of the half-built arch began to careen heavily toward the rock face.
Burr was watching his masterpiece, and the $100,000 investment of his backers just get chewed to pieces by the river.
The project was on the verge of total collapse. Burr writes about mobilizing his crew in the pitch black, quote, "in the darkest of nights."
Can you imagine?
No. The men were scrambling across small, slick, wet timbers, jumping from one violently heaving raft to another over the freezing black water.
It's a miracle no one died right then.
Truly. And Burr essentially throws money at the problem to save the timber. He secures the ark by lashing it to the shore using $1,500 worth of rope.
And to put that in perspective, $1,500 in 1814 could buy an entire farm.
Wow.
He used an absolute fortune in heavy cordage just to tether the violently bucking structure to the granite cliffs, preventing the arch from sliding off the shattered floats into the abyss.
It was an astonishing display of crisis management, but it left Burr in an impossible situation. I mean, the floats were pulverized, the arch was tethered but immovable, the river was choked with ice.
Most engineers would have just abandoned the project until the spring thaw.
Right. And I have to ask, why didn't he? Why risk the lives of his crew to keep pushing forward in December? Was it purely the financial pressure of the bridge company's investors? Or was he worried the half-finished timber would rot or be swept away completely by the spring floods?
It was really a combination of momentum, financial pressure, and an understanding of the river's seasonal volatility.
Okay.
The spring thaw on the Susquehanna is often accompanied by massive, violent floods as the upriver ice breaks apart. If he left a half-finished arch tethered to the shore, the spring floods would undoubtedly obliterate it.
So it was now or never.
He had to finish it, or lose it entirely. Burr realized he could no longer fight the ice. The floats had failed, so he executed one of the most audacious pivots in the history of civil engineering.
He decided to use the ice itself as his construction platform.
He weaponized the environment.
It's brilliant. In late December, a massive freeze hit the region. Burr describes a mountain of ice locking into the gorge. The ice packed into the bottleneck, rising 10 feet above the normal surface of the water, stretching solidly for a mile above and below the ferry site.
But this was not the smooth, glassy ice of a skating pond.
No.
This was an incredibly dangerous surface. Burr explained to Field that while the top few feet were somewhat solid, beneath that crust lay up to 60 feet of what the locals called mush ice.
Mush ice, which is basically ground up Brazil ice. As the river flowed over the rocky shallows near Turkey Hill, about 15 miles to the north, the ice shattered and broke into millions of tiny particles.
Right.
These particles flowed downriver and jammed into the McCall's Ferry Gorge, packing together into a 60-foot deep, violently shifting slurpee of death.
Slurpee of death is a very accurate description.
It wasn't solid, it was a highly pressurized slush fund, and Burr looked at this unstable 60-foot deep slurry and decided it was solid enough to drag a multi-ton wooden arch across.
The labor required to execute this plan borders on the superhuman. We are talking about late December through the end of January. Burr mobilized a workforce of between 40 and 120 men working every single day.
And what fascinates me is that these weren't specialized, heavy construction crews imported from a big city. These were mostly local volunteers from Lancaster and York counties.
Farmers, mostly.
Yeah, the local agrarian community, the mill workers. They abandoned their winter routines to physically drag this bridge into existence. It speaks volumes about the economic desperation we discussed earlier. They knew how much this infrastructure would change their lives.
And the physical toll on these volunteers was extreme. To move the massive arch sections over the jagged, uneven ice pack, they first had to level the surface.
How do you even do that?
Using axes, adzes, and iron bars. The men chipped away at the jagged ice ridges to create relatively flat roads across the frozen gorge.
That is backbreaking work.
And then they carefully dismantled the half arches from the ruined floats and maneuvered them onto massive wooden sleds equipped with runners.
Wow. And to generate the immense pulling power required, they couldn't just use horses on the unstable mush ice, right?
No, the horses would fall through.
Right. So they used capstans. And a capstan is a vertical rotating cylinder, traditionally used on large sailing ships to haul up heavy anchors.
Exactly.
Burr's crew anchored 8 giant capstans into the ice and the rock shores. They spooled thick ropes around the cylinders and attached the other ends to the loaded sleds.
And then up to 50 men at a time would man the wooden spokes of a single capstan. They would lean their entire body weight against the heavy timber bars, slowly walking in a circle, winding the rope around the cylinder, pulling the sleds inch by agonizing inch across the ice rollers.
That is so dangerous. If a rope snapped under that kind of tension, it could easily kill a man.
Oh, instantly.
If the mush ice gave way, the sled, the timber, and the men would disappear into the freezing water.
And Burr's letter paints a grim picture of the daily reality. He noted the weather was atrocious, a constant barrage of rain, sleet, and snow.
Of course it was.
The surface of the ice was constantly shifting and cracking, meaning the men had to continuously re-level their improvised roads.
But the most shocking detail Burr provides is about the water exposure. He wrote that the men, quote, were in up to their arms 40 times a day.
Yeah, that part is just, it's hard to even comprehend.
Imagine the hypothermia risk. Plunging up to your armpits in freezing water, climbing out in the January wind, and immediately throwing your shoulder against a capstan bar to heave a massive timber.
In an era before waterproof synthetics, insulated dry suits, or modern emergency medicine, enduring that level of cold exposure while performing maximal physical exertion is almost unfathomable.
It required a level of raw grit that defines early American expansion.
It really does. Yet, despite the agonizing pace and the sheer physical trauma, the process worked.
It worked. Over weeks of brutal labor, the crews slowly hauled the eastern half of the arch out from the Lancaster shore and wheeled the western half from the stone pier.
They were slowly bringing the two massive jaws of the bridge together over the middle of the gorge.
And finally, on January 31st, 1815, they are ready for the climax. The two halves of the 360-foot arch meet in the center.
The tension must have been incredible.
Burr's crew carefully keys the crown of the arch together, driving the massive wooden pegs home to lock the tension and compression forces into place. It is tight. At 8:30 in the evening, in the pitch black, the order is given to cut away the temporary wooden scaffolding that was holding the arch up from the sleds.
The transfer of weight. This is the moment of truth in any arch construction.
Right, because when the scaffolding is knocked away, the dead load of the timber settles. Gravity pulls down on the structure, forcing the arch to push outward against the stone abutment and the pier.
If Burr's calculations were wrong, if the joinery was weak, the arch would buckle and explode outward, crushing the men on the ice below.
But it didn't. Burr describes this moment beautifully in his letter. The entire operation was illuminated by the flickering light of massive bonfires burning on the shores. Burr wrote, "The whole now exhibited the grandest spectacle I ever saw. The men stood on the ice, watching the shore abutment, and tracing the massive wooden arch as it rose gracefully upward, extending itself westward over the ice, disappearing into the dark toward the pier. The weight settled, the joints held, the arch did not break."
And the men just erupted into loud, repeated hurrahs.
They cheered. He keyed the crown of the world's longest wooden arch 70 feet above the low water mark.
And he accomplished this with only a scant margin of time before the weather shifted and the mush ice eventually broke apart and flushed down the bay.
It was a flawless execution of an improvised plan.
It really was.
And the statistics regarding the workforce are perhaps the most surprising part of this entire ordeal.
Oh, the injury reports.
Yeah. Despite the terrifying working conditions, the heavy swinging timber, the capstans under massive tension, and the 60-foot deep slurry beneath their feet, casualties were miraculously low.
Which makes no sense.
None. Burr noted that he provided, unquote, abundant supply of liquor to the men, which was a standard practice of the era intended to provide a perceived warmth and caloric boost.
Right. A very common 19th century workplace perk.
Yeah, but Burr claimed that out of the entire workforce over those grueling months, only 2 men were ever seen drunk.
Well, it speaks to the intense collective focus of the workforce. When you are operating in a highly lethal environment, relying entirely on the men standing next to you to hold a rope line or steady a heavy timber, discipline is self-enforcing.
Yeah, a drunken mistake meant immediate death for yourself and your neighbors.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the only major accident recorded during the construction. A worker named August Stoughton lost his footing. He plummeted 54 feet from the upper timber framing.
That's a huge drop.
Massive. And on the way down, his body violently struck the heavy wooden cross braces not once, but twice, before he finally splashed into the freezing river.
Oh, brutal.
Given the height, the impact on the braces, and the thermal shock of the water, that should have been a fatal accident. But Stoughton was pulled from the water, survived the ordeal, and incredibly, returned to work on the bridge just a few days later.
Talk about the sheer resilience of the human body, coupled with a tremendous amount of luck, obviously.
Obviously.
But Stoughton's survival mirrored the survival of the bridge itself. Against all scientific odds, geographical hostility, and severe weather, Burr's masterclass in crisis engineering succeeded. He conquered the impossible gorge.
The brutal labor paved the way for a triumphant opening. With the massive main arch secure, the crew quickly finished the shorter span on the York side. They laid down the heavy timber decking, they added siding, and finally constructed a roof over the entire structure.
Which was necessary to protect the intricate truss joinery from rainwater and rot.
Exactly. And the transformation of the landscape was profound. A perilous, terrifying journey across a lethal bottleneck that historically required a dangerous ferry ride and a great deal of luck now took exactly 1/2 mile by horse and buggy, entirely shielded from the element.
It ushered in an incredibly glorious, albeit brief, golden age for McCall's Ferry.
A golden age.
The psychological and economic impact on the region cannot be overstated. While the exact date of the formal dedication is lost to the fragmented historical record, multiple sources confirm it was an event of massive regional significance.
Hundreds of citizens from both counties converged on the gorge.
The atmosphere was absolutely electric.
People were so eager to participate that they arrived the evening before the dedication just to camp out on the riverbanks and fish.
Yeah, like a modern tailgate.
Totally. The next morning, families threw elaborate dinner parties, spreading their meals on blankets directly on the brand new raw timber floorboards of the bridge. They were picnicking inside the belly of the beast.
That is such a great image.
And Theodore Burr was the star of the show. The historical accounts describe him parading back and forth through the massive crowd on horseback, wearing a towering high silk hat, soaking in the adulation.
I mean, he had every right to the silk hat. He had just executed the longest single wooden-covered span in human history over an abyss that the architect of the Capitol declared unbridgeable.
Yeah, he earned that hat.
But, the detail about the picnics on the floorboards points to a fascinating psychological phenomenon regarding public infrastructure.
I want to focus on that because put yourself in the shoes of a Lancaster farmer in 1815. You have lived near this county line your whole life. You know the folklore of the river.
You know the Susquehanna swallows people.
Right. You have seen the ice jams. You know Latrobe couldn't find the bottom. And suddenly, you are eating a ham sandwich suspended 70 feet in the air, casually sitting inside a wooden tunnel while the deadly rapids roar invisibly below your feet.
The cognitive dissonance is staggering.
How did people transition so quickly from terror to total trust?
Well, infrastructure acts as a tangible, physical manifestation of human dominance over the natural world.
Okay.
Before the bridge, the river dictated the terms of human movement. You crossed when the river allowed it, or you died trying. The bridge inverted that power dynamic.
It proved we were in charge.
Exactly. Walking out over that 360-foot span, hearing the solid, heavy echo of your own footsteps inside the wooden roof, feeling the absolute rigidity of the Burr arch truss. It provided a powerful illusion of absolute control. The bridge wasn't just a road. It was a monument proving that human engineering had subdued the chaotic violence of the river.
And that sense of mastery fueled an immediate economic explosion. The Lancaster York history and legend records claim that by 1817, just 2 years after the dedication, the volume of traffic crossing at McCall's Ferry actually outpaced the major established crossing upriver in Columbia.
That's huge.
It functioned perfectly as the winter line of communication between Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. The heavy freight wagons, the mail coaches, the wealthy travelers in private carriages, and the itinerant farmers all funneled through Burr's wooden tunnel.
And the toll revenues poured in, vindicating the immense financial gamble of the bridge company investors.
Everyone was happy.
The architecture functioned precisely as designed. effortlessly distributing the dynamic weight of heavy wagons across the massive arches into the stone abutments. But, human nature is rarely content to simply enjoy a triumph.
No, of course not.
When we conquer something that previously terrified us, a subtle paranoia often creeps in.
It is the inevitable backlash of hubris. The physical engineering was flawless, but the locals couldn't just accept it as a marvel of physics. They started looking for a metaphysical catch.
A curse.
Exactly. The bridge was born out of extremity, danger, and struggle. And the local population began to project their own moral anxieties onto the structure. The folklore quickly developed, and the primary target of these superstitions was Theodore Burr's vocabulary.
Oh, this is my favorite part. During the agonizing winter construction, the local volunteers and sightseers had watched Burr fighting for the life of his project.
Yeah.
When the ice was crushing his floats and his massive timber arch was careening toward the rocks, Burr was operating under unimaginable stress, and his language reflected the severity of the crisis.
The historical sources politely note that Burr was, quote, noted for his profanity.
Which is putting it mildly.
Very mildly. While he was dangling over the freezing water, wrestling with heavy timber, constantly recalculating tension loads, and keeping one eye on the terrifying mush ice, he was using his entire vocabulary. He was cursing loudly, creatively, and constantly.
And the good, pious people of the Lancaster countryside, standing on the shores watching this unfold, were scandalized.
Pearl-clutching.
Exactly. They looked at this magnificent feat of engineering, and instead of praising the structural integrity of the truss, they formulated a religious prophecy. The local consensus became, the Lord will never let it stand because the man swears too much.
It is a fascinating sociological coping mechanism. The locals were applying a strict moral framework to an inanimate object, but the mythology of McCall's Ferry didn't stop with Burr's swearing. The narrative demanded a more direct catalyst for the eventual doom of the bridge.
And the local folklore provided one in the form of a young man who would eventually become a titan of 19th century American politics, Thaddeus Stevens.
Thaddeus Stevens. Before he was known as the Old Commoner, before he became the fierce, uncompromising congressman who championed abolition, authored the 14th Amendment, and drove the radical reconstruction of the South. He was simply a young, ambitious lawyer trying to get home.
Yep.
The legend states that Stevens was celebrating his admission to the Maryland bar down in Bel Air. He is riding his horse north toward Lancaster to visit a friend. He arrives at the York County approach to Burr's magnificent bridge, but he notices a flaw in the infrastructure. He sees broken floorboards on the deck.
Which, to be fair, broken floorboards on a heavily trafficked wooden bridge aren't particularly unusual. Heavy iron-rimmed wagon wheels cause severe wear and tear.
Sure.
But for a man on horseback, a hole in the decking is a major hazard. If the horse steps through and snaps a leg in the heavy timber, it's a catastrophic situation.
Oh, absolutely.
So Stevens, acting with characteristic caution, decides not to risk his mount. He dismounts and proceeds on foot, leading his horse by the reins to carefully navigate the damaged decking.
But the universe has a sharp sense of irony.
It really does.
Stevens is carefully watching his horse's hooves, guiding the animal around the gaps. He takes a few steps onto the bridge, and his own foot finds one of the openings. The young lawyer plunges straight through the heavy floorboards and drops toward the Susquehanna River.
Fortunately for Stevens, he was near the shoreline approach, where the drop to the water was significantly less severe than the 70-foot plunge over the main channel.
Thank goodness.
And the river was experiencing a low flow that day, so he suffered a severe ducking in the cold water and a bruised ego, but he survived the fall and scrambled back up to the safety of the bridge deck.
He was completely unharmed, but he was absolutely enraged. He is a newly minted lawyer, his fine clothes are soaked with muddy river water, and his pride is entirely shattered.
Oh, he was furious.
The legend says that as he trudged across the remainder of the bridge and finally set foot on the solid ground of the Lancaster side, he turned back toward the structure and unleashed a legendary curse.
He swore to all the gods and saints that he would never set foot on that bridge again.
And crucially for the folklore, he loudly prayed that for the good of all the public, the Lord would simply remove the bridge entirely.
And when the bridge inevitably fell a short time later, the local population immediately seized upon this specific event. For years afterward, according to the Lancaster York history and legend, the regional tradition laid the blame for the destruction squarely at the feet of Thaddeus Stevens and his angry curse.
I want to pause and look at the sociology of this folklore because it reveals so much about the human psyche.
It does.
We have a highly unstable, rocky river gorge, a place where millions of gallons of water are funneled into a 264-foot gap, a place that produces anchor ice, 60-foot deep mush ice, and rapid 10-foot floods during a mild winter storm. The physics of the location dictate an incredibly high probability of catastrophic failure.
It's a ticking time bomb.
Exactly. Yet when the bridge finally falls, the local population collectively decides, yes, it was definitely destroyed because the architect had a potty mouth and a wet lawyer asked God to smite it. I mean, why is it so much easier for people to blame a curse rather than acknowledging the obvious physical realities of the environment?
Well, it comes back to the psychological concept of control and existential terror.
Okay, unpack that.
In a pre-modern era, the raw forces of nature, like a river like the Susquehanna and McCall's Ferry, were terrifyingly indifferent. Nature does not care if you are a good person, a skilled engineer, or a vital part of the economy. It is chaotic, lethal, and entirely out of human control.
Right.
That is a deeply unsettling reality to live next to. So by attributing the failure of massive infrastructure to a moral failing like swearing or a specific vocalized curse by a prominent figure, the community is attempting to impose a rational narrative onto an irrational force.
It humanizes the violence.
Exactly. If the bridge fell because of a curse, then the universe operates by a set of rules. Actions have consequences. But if the bridge fell simply because the river is a brutal, unstoppable force of physics, well, that implies humans are entirely at the mercy of a chaotic planet. We prefer the safety of the curse.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense. The narrative of the curse provides comfort, but the narrative couldn't change the hydrodynamics. And that brings us to the final apocalyptic chapter of Burr's masterpiece.
The end.
The curses and superstitions seem to manifest just 2 years after the bridge was triumphantly opened. But it wasn't divine intervention that came knocking. It was the ghost of Benjamin Henry Latrobe.
He was right all along.
His 1801 warning that the sudden, rapid rising of the water made a safe bridge impossible came back to collect its due.
Latrobe understood the bottleneck. In early March of 1818, the Susquehanna River proved his scientific pessimism entirely correct.
The winter had been severe, locking the entire river basin under deep, heavy ice. As March arrived, the temperature shifted, and the spring thaw began.
And the archival accounts from the Lancaster Intelligencer read like the script of a disaster film.
They really do. On Monday, March 2nd, the immense sheet of ice covering the Susquehanna begins to fracture and move. Further south, below the Maryland line, the ice breaks up cleanly and passes off into the Chesapeake Bay harmlessly. But upstream, the sheer volume of water melting off the Pennsylvania hills creates a massive surge.
On Monday night, the water level at McCall's Ferry begins to rise, and it keeps rising all through Tuesday with a rapidity that stuns the locals.
The Intelligencer reported that the height of the descending water was greater than had been known by the oldest inhabitants of the region in 40 years.
It was a generational flood event, a massive influx of kinetic energy moving rapidly down the river corridor.
Vast quantities of thick, heavy ice are floating down on this surging tide, acting as battering rams, sweeping away trees, docks, and outbuildings before it. And then, this unimaginable volume of water and grinding ice hits the granite hills at McCall's Ferry.
The funnel.
Millions of gallons are suddenly forced into that tight, 264-foot wide funnel. The hydrodynamics completely break down. The water cannot move forward fast enough to relieve the pressure, so it has only one direction left to go. Straight up.
And the resulting surge is apocalyptic. The water in that narrow rock canyon rises to a height that defies belief. The contemporary accounts state clearly that the water rose, quote, nearly 80 feet in perpendicular.
80 feet. I try to visualize this and it breaks my brain. I liken it to a tsunami inside a bathtub. An 80-foot vertical wall of surging, churning, black water completely choked with massive grinding slabs of river ice confined within the rock cliffs, hurtling upward and forward directly toward Burr's wooden masterpiece.
It's hard to even picture.
But here's the detail that absolutely floored me during my research. Faced with an 80-foot vertical rise of ice and water, the bridge did not instantly shatter. The Intelligencer specifically noted that the bridge stood its ground, fully intact, until the ice jam rose so high that it began to shoot over the top of the roof.
That is the ultimate vindication of Theodore Burr's engineering genius.
Unbelievable.
Think about the sheer hydrostatic pressure being exerted against the side of that bridge. The water level rose from the low water mark, engulfed the 55-foot stone pier, reached the 70-foot mark where the arch was keyed, swallowed the heavy timber floorboards, climbed the siding, and literally began pouring over the pitched wooden roof of the structure.
The bridge was entirely submerged in a raging torrent of ice, and yet the Burr arch truss refused to snap.
The joinery, the multiple king post truss, the massive arches, they all held perfectly together under unimaginable sheer stress.
It wasn't until Tuesday evening, March 3rd, that the river finally won. And even then, it didn't break the arch. The immense buoyant force of the water and the physical leverage of the ice simply lifted the entire magnificent 360-foot structure right off its stone abutment and lifted it off the central pier.
The river essentially plucked the bridge off its foundations. The structure was carried away whole with an irresistible force, swept down the surging current of the Susquehanna.
And the aftermath of this flood is spectacular. The bridge acts as a massive wooden ship navigating the rapids. Eventually, the immense forces of the river break the structure into its two constituent arches.
Right.
One of the intact arches gets swept downstream and becomes violently wedged on an island near Peach Bottom Ferry, roughly 8 miles away. But the other massive arch, the legendary 360-foot span, sails even further downriver.
This is the crazy part.
Incredibly, as it approaches the Rock Run Bridge in Maryland, it manages to physically pass under one of the stone arches of that bridge, damaging it slightly as it squeezes through, before finally running aground on the mudflats below Havre de Grace, Maryland. It traveled nearly 20 miles downriver, largely intact.
It is a tragic, awe-inspiring conclusion. Burr built the structure so perfectly rigid, so fundamentally sound, that an 80-foot wall of ice couldn't destroy his arches. It could only relocate them.
That's a great way to put it.
But the destruction of the bridge marked the end of an era. Theodore Burr, the master builder who conquered the mush ice, died just a few years later in November of 1822. And the state of Pennsylvania, along with the ambitious bridge companies, finally absorbed the brutal lesson the river had taught them.
They looked at the shattered stone pier, they looked at the high water marks 80 feet up the granite cliffs, and they finally admitted defeat. True to Latrobe's 1801 warning, the bridge at McCall's Ferry was never rebuilt.
No, it wasn't.
The locals went back to risking their lives on ferries or taking long detours. The gorge remained unconquered for exactly 150 years. It wasn't until August 21st, 1968, that the massive concrete and steel span of the Norman Wood Bridge finally opened to carry traffic across the lower river in that region.
And you better believe modern engineers built that deck well over 100 feet above the water.
They learned their lesson.
The story of McCall's Ferry encapsulates the beautiful, violent tension of early American infrastructure. Theodore Burr proved that human ingenuity could indeed conquer the impossible gorge, utilizing revolutionary truss designs and superhuman labor. But the Susquehanna River proved that Latrobe's foundational assessment was the ultimate truth. You cannot build a safe bridge there.
Burr won the battle, but hydrodynamics won the war.
Nature always bats last.
Nature always bats last. To summarize our deep dive today, we have spent the last hour meticulously unpacking the incredible, fleeting 3-year lifespan of the McCall's Ferry Bridge.
What a ride.
We explored how a 360-foot marvel of wooden engineering was sandwiched between a pessimistic, scientifically accurate surveyor and an apocalyptic 80-foot ice flood. It survived the crushing pressures of anchor ice, the brutal realities of freezing winter labor, and even the moral cursing of its own creator and a future congressman.
It was a masterpiece of tension and compression that was ultimately swallowed whole by the very river it dominated.
It remains one of the most phenomenal yet forgotten chapters in the history of civil engineering.
I completely agree.
And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over long after this deep dive ends. Think about the physical site of McCall's Ferry today. For a century and a half after Burr's Bridge washed down to Maryland, no one dared challenge that specific granite funnel again.
It was left alone.
Right. And eventually, human engineering fundamentally changed its strategy. We decided to stop trying to bridge the violent, rapid waters of McCall's Ferry altogether. Instead, modern engineers built the massive Holtwood Dam downstream. As the dam was completed, the backwaters slowly rose up and deliberately drowned the entire gorge. The fierce churning rapids, the jagged rocky cliffs, the terrifying 180-foot deep abyss that Latrobe couldn't sound, and the invisible ghost of Theodore Burr's magnificent wooden arch. They were all permanently erased. Today, they are submerged, sleeping quietly under the placid, calm surface of a massive recreational lake. So, as you go about your day driving effortlessly over modern concrete highway spans or looking out at calm, beautiful reservoirs, ask yourself what other impossible engineering marvels, what other epic forgotten battles between human ambition and the raw violence of nature are currently sleeping quietly beneath the surface of our modern world.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Uncharted Lancaster podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating or review wherever you listen. It really helps more people discover the show. For more fascinating local history, visit unchartedlancaster.com. And if you'd like to go deeper, check out one of Adam Zern's books at unchartedlancaster.com/books. Until next time, keep exploring.